Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So this is a first look at two swords that have been sent to me to review by Darksword Armory. Now, the first thing I want to say is that Darksword Armory are not a brand that has been featured on this channel before, but I actually approached them partly because I've seen reviews of their swords on other channels, and I was very interested to see some in the flesh for myself, and also quite impressed by what I saw. I'm to put these down, put one of these down for a second. So they've sent me two swords. This one is called the Squire, and it's a new model of sword. It's a very light one-handed sword. I'll talk more about that in a minute. This is a large longsword, known as the medieval two-handed sword, or I noticed that in emails they also refer to it as a Gothic sword. So I think their names are fluctuating a bit, but they've got serial numbers essentially. But if you look in the links below, you can get direct links to the Darksword Armory website where you can find both of these models of sword. Before I go on, I just want to explain a little bit of context. So Darksword Armory, I'd not seen any in the flesh before, but I'd seen them online. They don't appear an awful lot in Europe. I've actually never seen anyone having any of these in Europe, so it'd be good to see more of them over here. Made in Canada, shipped over here with no problems at all, came straight to me, and I am very, very impressed, extremely impressed actually, particularly by the blades. Now that's not to say that the hilts are bad, and I'll talk more in detail about the hilts. They come with scabbards as well. You'll notice on their website there are different options for scabbards and belts and this kind of stuff. I'm going to discuss scabbards at the end of this review, and I'm also going to try and keep this first review as concise as possible. So this is really first impressions, first thoughts. I've actually had these swords for a few weeks now, so I've got to know them, I've played with them, I've twizzled them around quite a bit, twirled them around. I haven't done any cutting with these yet, and there will be cutting videos, but I haven't done that yet, so that will be coming in a separate review, and that will obviously have additional aspects of review to this review here. So this is really first impressions, dry handling, you know, fit and finish, this kind of thing. And I'm going to review both of them in this video. Now I'm going to start off with the one-handed sword, the Squire. Now, as I say, I'm going to look at the scabbards last, so I'm going to dispense with the scabbard now. Okay. So, first up, this is a really light arming sword. This is a 15th century style sword, not dissimilar in some ways to Henry V's sword, or Henry V's so-called sword. It was probably or possibly Henry VI's sword actually, but that's for another video. Well, I have discussed it in the past, but anyway, we'll deal with that another time. But the blade is actually quite similar to the Westminster Abbey so-called Henry V sword, and this is a super light and nimble little sword. This sort of arming sword could be carried by a knight, could be carried by an archer, billman, anyone in the 15th century could have carried this kind of sword. And this is very much a sidearm. This is a small, light, quick sword to get out, to draw, and could be used obviously with a buckler or perhaps even a larger shield as well, or could be used in civilian life by itself. These are sometimes called, in Ewart Oakeshot's books, for example, smaller arming swords like this are sometimes referred to as riding swords, although riding swords tend to be even smaller than this. But this is very much the sort of thing that could have been used in the civilian world. So first up, first impressions. It looks very, very nice. It's beautifully proportioned. It handles wonderfully. It's so light and so quick. Now, breaking it down into its constituent parts, the two best parts of this sword, and in fact of both the swords in my opinion, are the blade and the grip. That's not to say that the guard and the pommel aren't good, but I'll talk a little bit more in detail about those in a second. First up, let's focus on the blade. Now, the stats on paper, and again the links below to these swords. So the stats on paper are that this blade is made of 5160, hand forged. It is supposed to be hardened so that it has around a 60 Rockwell edge, which is very hard, certainly much harder than most European swords of the period. So it should have a very good hard, resilient cutting edge. With around a 4850 Rockwell in the core. So essentially it's a relatively complex and I imagine quite precisely analysed heat treatment process that they go through at Darksword Armory. And the the blade itself, in terms of its form, is absolutely gorgeous. It has a hollow grind. I don't know how well you'll be able to see that on camera, but the bevels are hollow ground. It has a very defined midrib. It has a very nice Type 15 overall shape, so it's an Oakshot Type 15 blade. Hollow ground with a midrib. Great, that reduces weight compared to rigidity, so it's a good rigid blade but also a light blade, and it has good distal taper. Now, some of you have noted that I used to have some digital calipers, or whatever you want to call them, measuring device, and why don't I use these anymore? Well, quite simply because we moved house and I can't find them. They went into a box and didn't appear, but I've got a new one. So let's have a little look at this distal taper. This blade, so I can't quite get to the base of the blade because of the languettes down here, but that starts out 6.5 millimeters. Good. 6.5 millimeters is historically very representative of arming swords. It's also relatively thick spine, bearing in mind this has got a hollow ground blade and a midrib, and halfway up the blade it goes down to 4.8 millimeters, and then sort of a couple of inches down from the tip it goes down to 3.3 millimeters. So as you can see, it has very marked distal taper. Now, when you add all of these things together, it's not a long blade, but when you add the fact that it has a defined midrib, it's got hollow grinding, it's got excellent distal taper, this all leads to a blade which feels absolutely lovely in the hand. It just moves like nothing, really. It's so easy to move around. It's beautiful, it's lovely. It's also very historically accurate and representative in every dimension, and also I also like to talk about edge geometry. It has excellent edge geometry. It has a micro secondary bevel, and it's quite sharp. It's not super sharp, so I am happy to run just about. I can feel a bit of biting there, but I'm happy to run my fingers lightly along the edge on both edges, but there is a little bit of bite there, and I know that this will go through water bottles. We'll see in a cutting test further down the line, but it's got good, beautiful edge geometry and pretty fine edges. I will sharpen this up at some point to be really razor sharp, but it is pretty sharp out of the box, as they call it. Now, the grip. So these are the two best things, in my opinion. If I'm going to put them up there, what are the absolute glowing things about this sword? The blade and the grip. The grip is lovely. It is as good as the typical, I won't name other brands in this video, but as good as the typical other really good make brands that people think of. It is a wooden cord. I'll show it here a bit closer. It's got a wooden core, and of course it's got cord, which is then leather wrapped, veg-tan leather, and then cord wrapped around, so it is all tight, it is solid, and it has got a very nice cross-sectional shape. It is quite flat and it's tapered, and it's got, I mean, you know, this is partly aesthetic preferences, so some of you will prefer this to other people, but of course they can do different shaped grips if required, but it's very nice that it is a flat-ish grip relative to the width, so it gives absolutely fantastic edge alignment. Really, you know, you can shut your eyes and you just know which direction that sword's going in. Now, onto the crossguard and pommel. So the first thing I would say is I really like the pommel, but there is one, and it is historically accurate. It's I would imagine lathe turned by the look of it rather than cast, because I can see circular marks on the inside of the recess, so I imagine that's made on a lathe and then polished. It is a peened, these are peened, both peened in construction incidentally, so they're a one-piece tang peened at the end, as they should be. The pommel is historically accurate and very nice. One minor detail I would note, so at the junction between the pommel and the grip is very slightly wider than the base of the pommel. I'll see if you can see what I mean there. Yeah, there we go. So you can see that the grip is very slightly wider each side, there and there, than the pommel itself. I would prefer if the grip came down and met that pommel such that there wasn't that lip there. So the width of the grip was the same as the width of the pommel. You can either do that by having the grip come down more, which would be the easiest way to do it, or I think that this sword might actually benefit from a slightly thicker pommel, or a pommel that tapers slightly. So Wheel pommels of this sort in the 15th century, they can either be, looking at them this direction, they can either be parallel, or they can widen towards the butt, towards the peen, or they can widen towards the grip. And we know that, for example, even just from one hoard, the Castillon swords from the River Dordogne, mid-15th century, associated perhaps with the Battle of Castillon, as documented by Ewart Oakeshott in a lot of books and articles. Those pommels can either come in a widening or a narrowing or a parallel form. So I think maybe Darksword Armory maybe want to have a look at the precise design details of this pommel and this grip and how they marry up. That being said, in terms of the weight of the pommel, I don't think the pommel needs to have any more mass to it at all. The balance and the sort of how it feels in the hand, the heft of the sword, feels absolutely lovely. So I don't think they'd want to particularly put a lighter pommel or a heavier pommel on. So if, for example, you tapered it so it was a bit thicker, you might want to put a deeper recess. You might want to balance that out in some way, basically. I think aesthetically speaking, and looking at Peter Johnson's designs and theories of medieval sword design, this sword may possibly look slightly more attractive with a slightly larger disc. But with such a light blade, that's difficult to achieve by having a larger disc without making a heavier pommel. So possibly, that's a minor thought. I just think it might look slightly better with a slightly bigger pommel. Now, the crossguard is my least favourite feature. And the reason for that is the design element on the centre of the crossguard here. And you'll see it's got this almost Art Deco kind of sweeping line up here. Now, Darksword Armory make a number of swords, some of which are pretty historically accurate, modelled on historical examples, and some of which are complete fantasy. And then they make some swords that are sort of somewhere in between the two things. They are, I suppose, artistically, they've got artistic license to them. So they're not exactly modelled on a historical example, but they're not pure fantasy. They're clearly inspired by historical examples. And I would put this sword, due to this crossguard, into that category, because I have never seen a medieval sword with a crossguard, although loosely of this shape. There are lots of 15th century swords with crossguards loosely of this shape. I have never seen one with this sort of element on the central, whatever you want to call it, escutcheon or langet, whatever. So personally, I think it's a little bit confused, because the sword as a whole looks bang on, you know, be happy in the middle of the 15th century, this sword, except for the middle of that crossguard. And me personally, I might grind those lines off and satin polish this guard, because to me that would be aesthetically preferable. So I wonder if what Darksword want to do is actually give options of maybe 2 or 3 different types of guard to have on these sword, or maybe look at maybe removing that design element on the guard or rethinking the guard. That would be my personal opinion. But I understand that they and some of you might absolutely love that design. So again, it's personal aesthetic choice. But overall, I absolutely love this sword. It is lovely, and it bears a lot of overall similarity to the so-called Henry V sword from Westminster Abbey. It is very well representative of a 15th century sword. One final minor detail I'd mention, relatively minor detail, and this is connected again to the design, the design element of the centre of this guard, is if we look at where the blade goes into the guard, you will see that it is a quite large hole. Now, you do get medieval swords like that. There's a couple of examples in the Museum of London, for example, which have quite a large aperture for the blade to go into. I think from a modern high-end, although their prices are very reasonable, their prices are kind of like medium price, I would say, in terms of price range. But if to compete with the highest end makers, having a guard that fits more snugly to the blade, I think would look more refined and would look sort of higher class, higher quality. So for me, the opening into the guard is a little bit big, a little bit wide for the blade, and a little bit scrappy. So overall, love this sword. I think the junction between the grip and the pommel might need a little bit of refining. And personally, I would think about changing some details about this guard. One other aesthetic thing to mention, so the polish of the blade. So there are other high-end makers that only give a satin polish to their blades, and I love the fact that Darksword Armory are doing a proper mirror polish on their blades. It looks beautiful, it's really beautifully done. But I personally don't particularly like the mirror finish on the guard and the pommel because it makes them look a little bit like modern cast chromed fittings, and I think that the hilt fittings might benefit from being in a satin polish. Again, that's personal opinion, but I think if the pommel and the guard were in satin finish and the blade mirror polish, I think that would look absolutely on the money. Right, now let's have a little look at the medieval longsword, a two-handed sword, or Gothic sword as they themselves referred to it by email. Now, this is one of the nicest longswords I have held in a long time, okay? This is absolutely gorgeous and it feels lovely in the hand. It's not a particularly light or particularly quick longsword. It is a big longsword with around a 39-inch blade. So this makes my other two longswords that I have at the moment actually look quite small. This is quite a big Type 18C blade, or 18B blade. And it's a beautiful, beautiful blade. Okay, I'll talk about the hilt in a second. Again, not negative, but I'll separate the two things. This blade is currently the nicest longsword blade I own, by quite a long margin. Okay, it is absolutely lovely, and it's also quite similar to a few examples in museums that I can think of. It's a bit like a scaled down version of the two-handed English two-handed sword in the Wallace collection, and it's just an absolutely gorgeous blade. It's a big blade, as I say, 39 inches, not particularly narrow. We'll look at the distal taper in a minute, but this, like the other blade I showed, this is a Type 18 hollow ground blade. So for its size and proportions, it does feel pretty maneuverable. It moves around nicely, but it also has authority. It has you can tell this is going to be a good cutter, and it is a big sword. It feels like almost the junction between a big longsword and a small two-handed sword. This is not a sword which you can very easily use in one hand. I mean, you can at a push. You could if you had a shield. You could if you're on horseback and you're just taking a swipe at someone or using the point. You can wield it in one hand, but it's not at all nimble in one hand. It doesn't make a very good one-hand sword. It is a true longsword. Really, it's a two-handed sword that can be occasionally used in one hand. Gorgeous, gorgeous blade, looks beautiful, beautifully finished, beautiful hollow grind, beautiful mid-rib, lovely edge geometry, just the same as the other sword. It's sharp enough that I don't want to apply pressure as I run my hand down the blade. It's not super sharp. I would prefer it if it was a little bit more sharp, but it's got a very micro secondary bevel, very good edge geometry. It's lovely. Now let's have a look at the distal taper for a minute, because the distal taper, I think, on this sword speaks volumes. So this blade starts off thickness at the base 7.1 millimeters. Okay, that is a good blade thickness. It's not a crazy blade thickness. You do get thicker longsword blades, but for this size of blade. And funnily enough, I was looking at some Museum of London two-handed sword stats recently, and it matches very closely to that. So it's, actually it says 7.2 millimeters now. Okay, coming up, let's come about 12 inches up the blade. I realise I'm mixing imperial and metric here, but 6.6 millimeters, good. So it's distal tapering down. Another quarter up the blade, we're down to 5.5 millimeters. Then a few inches down from the tip, 4.2 millimeters, and then up right near the tip, 3.1 millimeters. So it has great distal taper, beautiful profile or silhouette taper, hollow ground, big blade, good edge geometry, lovely. Now, let's look at the hilt. So, as before, solid tang peen construction. The blade, incidentally, same as before, 5160, hardened to about 60 Rockwell on the edge, more like 48 or 50 in the middle. Great. You couldn't really wish for more. The grip, again, absolutely gorgeous, as good as any other grip I've ever had. Okay, it's wooden core with veg-tanned leather, cord underneath. The leather very nicely spliced down the edge and glued, very thin, almost no rib there whatsoever. then glued, bound over the top, so you've got this very, very nice texture. And it's got ribs down it as well, for my pleasure. And it gives a beautiful grip. It's got just enough friction that your hand doesn't slide anywhere, but not enough friction to make your hand sore. The pommel is a fishtail pommel, which, funnily enough, I've never owned an example of, but I've always wanted one. So there you go, now I've got one. Thank you, Darksword Armory. You can see the peening is nicely done at the end there and quite large. Certainly, well, appropriately sized, should we say, but a nice strong peen. Beautifully formed fishtail pommel. One slight sort of constructive, not criticism even, but slight note on the fishtail pommel. Some of the edges are a little bit, I won't say sharp, but they could be a little bit more rounded. Of course you can do that yourself, but particularly where I'll note it is just here where the corners meet the grip. So very, very slightly, those corners can create a hot spot where your hand transitions from the grip to the pommel. Now, as I've spoken about in previous videos, historically speaking, some treatises tell you not to grip the pommel. Some treatises assume you are going to grip the pommel and certainly show you gripping the pommel in the artwork. With this type of sword, the implication is that the pommel is an extension of the grip. Okay, so, and I personally do grip the pommel because I follow Italian sources that basically almost all show that. So I grip the hilt down there. So my hand is 50% on the grip and 50% on the pommel, and therefore my hand is going over that junction between the pommel and the grip. So despite the fact it's not caused me any problems, there is the potential there for that, and so I should mention it. I should also mention that some of these edges and angles up here can be a little bit on the edgy side, should we say, on the slightly sharp side. And if they were just rounded off a little bit more, I think it would make the pommel friendlier for more people. I mean, I've got fairly rough hands, but I realise some people out there maybe don't. They've maybe got smoother hands and might find that a little bit spiky to grip. But I think it looks absolutely fantastic, looks the part, and it has got historical precedence again in Castillon swords, mid 15th century and later 15th century examples as well in various museums and found archaeologically as well. So a very nice type of pommel that was popular, in fact, all over Europe from about 1440 onwards, and was still very popular in the 1480s, 1490s. So good section of the 15th century, beautiful. So grip, I love it. Pommel, I love it, with a few small tweaks maybe if I really want to be really, really picky. Now the guard, again, much like the arming sword, the Squire, the guard is the, I suppose, if I have to choose, is my least favourite of all the elements. That being said, I do like the guard on this sword, and I prefer the guard on this sword to the guard on the Squire, personally speaking. That being said, there's a couple of, well, in fact, three main things that I would personally change. So if I was going to bring out a version 2 of this sword, or a slight update to it, my advice would be these three things. Number one, I think the guard's not long enough for the sword. Okay, so if we look at the overall proportions of this sword, now I'm going to caveat what I'm saying here with the fact that we have a few of these fishtail pommelled swords both as bastard swords, hand and a half swords, and as arming swords. And they do tend to have guards which are quite short for their overall proportions. So in a sense, the fact that they've chosen quite a short guard on this is not unhistorical, but I personally think that for such a big blade, a 39-inch blade, and for a relatively long hilt as well, and again, if you check the link below, you can check all of the stats for this sword, I think that this guard should probably be about 1.5 inches longer on each quillon, personally. And I think that overall the sword would look more correct and more balanced, sort of geometrically as it were, if the guard was a little bit longer, maybe as much as 2 inches longer on each side. And swords, long swords of this proportion, functionally do benefit from having quite large guards, because of the size of the blade being involved and the extra protection that that affords. But they also seem to look more balanced overall with a slightly longer guard. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the cross section of this guard, you'll notice it has quite a projecting sort of triangular sections on each side of the blade. Now that does look quite cool. But one of the issues that I think some people who love longswords and do longsword fencing and want to cut with this sword in the way that they would cut doing their Lichtenauer or any other German system, is that they want to put the thumb on the flat of the blade or even on the side of the grip. Now you can do it if you put the thumb on the flat of the grip here, okay, no problem. But if you want to put the thumb on the blade, that projecting point, as you see, because it sticks out quite a long way upwards, kind of gets in the way, and it means that there isn't a smooth transition between the grip and the blade. So if you want to put the thumb on the blade to do zwerk or twerk type movements, you can do it, but you have to kind of arch the thumb over that projection. So it's not really very convenient. I have to say also, looking at the end, this is part and parcel of the same point incidentally, that you'll notice it's quite, the guard's quite straight and then steps out quite suddenly. If this was a little bit more nuanced and transitioned and it didn't step out quite so far, I think it would look better and it would work better functionally as well. I also think it would be a stronger guard, because this junction where it comes from this wide triangular section down to this straight section is a weak point, and when longsword guards get hit, especially by other longswords, there's a lot of leverage comes down to that, and that will be a bending or breaking point. So I personally would redesign the shape of this guard and make it slightly longer, and I'd make the projecting bits at the side slightly lower in profile and more tapered into the rest of the quillon. The final thing is the same point as I mentioned, so this is the third point for the guard. The same thing as I mentioned for the arming sword is that the aperture or opening where the blade goes into the guard is a long rectangle, and really it shouldn't be a rectangle, it should be a similar shape to the blade cross section. So in other words, a flattened lozenge, and the guard hull here, here and here should sit closer to the blade surface itself. So really I personally would redesign the guard in those three ways, make it sit closer to the blade and change the size and shape of it slightly. But that being said, as with the other sword, this is still an extremely, extremely nice sword that I absolutely love. This is, without any comparison, my favourite longsword. You know that I own longswords from a number of different manufacturers. This is, if I had to just take one longsword from my collection and keep that and get rid of all the others, I'd keep this one. It is absolutely gorgeous. And you know, I've worked with many different manufacturers over the years and done reviews of lots of swords and owned lots of swords. And the hardest thing to get right is a blade, okay? The hilt, really, I think lots of people can get hilts right. Not that many people can get blades right. And the fact that Darksword Armory have got such nice blades on these two swords is really impressive. I'm really, really surprised by how lovely these blades are, how well formed they are, their proportions, their distal taper, their edge geometry, their hollow grind, the definition of their midrib. You know, obviously there's no twists or warps or anything else like that. They've got everything. If you look at my kind of checklist on the Matt Easton website of the things I look for from a good blade, this meets all of the criteria, and so does the one-handed sword. Okay, fantastic blades. Personally, I'd tweak a few things with the hilts, but that's relatively minor. Okay, so Darksword Armory, I am super, super impressed, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more stuff from Darksword. I'm also really looking forward to testing out these blades, and also we have to caveat everything I've said about the construction is caveated by the fact that I haven't yet cut with these swords. I haven't put them through their paces and tested them, so that will be another video, and that will be another thing to look out for. Now, before I finish off, I want to mention the scabbards. So the first thing, and I just get one scabbard because they are both incidentally basically the same design. One is just bigger for the bigger blade. So the first thing to say is I think it's wonderful that in this price category they are giving scabbards with sharp blades. I've always thought it's scandalous that you pay a lot of money for a sharp sword from a manufacturer and then have to pay almost the same amount of money again to get a nice scabbard. It is awesome that they are putting scabbards with these sharp swords. It's also great from a safety point of view because these are sharp blades and, you know, they're not very safe things to have lying around. So it's great that you've got a safe place to store them. Now, the scabbards, in terms of what they are, in terms of construction and stuff, are perfectly nice. They're nicely made. The leather seems decent quality, and they are of a historical design. Okay, but this is where the criticism comes. So I spoke to Darksword about this, and one of the issues with these scabbards is they are made for an earlier style of sword than these. Now, Darksword decided for production efficiency to make one style of scabbard available for all their swords, and they make swords that go back to the Roman era, right the way through the so-called Dark Ages, the Viking era and stuff, and through to the early Renaissance. And they all have one style of scabbard, which for someone who's into history is a little bit difficult to swallow, because this is a kind of, well, let's say it's a 11th, 12th century style of scabbard. It's the sort of thing that could have been worn at the Battle of Hastings or could have been worn in the First or Second Crusade, perhaps even as late as the Third Crusade, but this isn't something that you'd really find with a 15th century sword. Okay, so it's a little bit weird. It looks a bit weird to have a 15th century sword housed in a kind of 11th, 12th century scabbard. Equally, if you had a Viking era sword, then the scabbard would be too late. So it's kind of difficult doing one style of scabbard and belt. It's particularly the belt system actually that gives it away. But doing one style of scabbard and belt for a broad historical period. My recommendation to Darksword would be to do maybe a basic scabbard that could have different belt fittings attached to it. So you'd still have the option to have a scabbard, maybe without all the belt stuff on, just a basic wood core lined leather covered scabbard that people could then modify and use as a basis to make specific to their kit or their period, whatever they want to do. That's just one suggestion, it's just one idea. The other, I mean, the ideal would be to have different scabbards for different periods. So you have your Migration era scabbard, you have your Viking era, you have your you know, kind of Crusades era scabbard, then you have your 15th century scabbard or whatever. But generally speaking, I would say they're nice scabbards, but they don't fit with 15th century swords. But maybe you could take some of this stuff off and maybe sort of retrofit it to do 15th century stuff. But in terms of the construction of them, they're perfectly nice. They've got a steel chape at the end, the leather's nice, and they're all well made, and you know, they are available. You do pay extra for the scabbards, so if you are ordering from Darksword, that's just something to bear in mind. That if you're ordering a sword for the period of these scabbards and belts, that's great. If you're ordering a 15th century sword, well, just remember that that belt and scabbard doesn't really go with that period of sword. Right, so to finish up there, these are really very, very nice swords, and I'm really excited actually about Darksword Armory's stuff and how they've come on in the last few years and what they're making now. To be making blades this nice is really no small achievement, and honestly, for me to give this glowing an endorsement to a blade, just ignoring the details about hilt design and anything else, just a blade, that should be seen as a major plus point, and you should definitely consider adding a Darksword Armory sword to your collection. And this particular model, I think a lot of people out there would really like one of these. And they've got other long swords as well, which look very, very nice. They've got some slightly earlier periods, some 14th century and early 15th century style long swords that look equally lovely. They've got a replica of the so-called Black Prince sword, bastard sword, which look very, very nice, be great for people doing fury. So they've got a bunch of different swords. Go and check out their website now, and I will be back hopefully soon doing some cutting with these swords and perhaps a little bit of movement stuff and just putting them through their paces and seeing what they can do. Thanks for watching. Check out the website below, give us a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you again soon for another video. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!